The bus station clock read 2:47 in the morning when I first understood what it meant to have nothing. $5. That was the entire weight of my future folded twice in the palm of my hand, the bill so worn it felt like cloth instead of paper. The fluorescent lights of the Cleveland Greyhound terminal hummed above me, casting that sickly yellow glow that makes every face look like a photograph someone forgot to throw away. Around me, a dozen other travelers slumped in plastic chairs, their bodies hidden under jackets and sweatshirts. Nobody was looking at us. That suited me just fine. My sister Della slept against my shoulder, her body pressed close enough that I could feel every breath she took. And every breath she took was a problem. That whistle, that thin, high whistle on the edge of every exhale. To anyone else it might have sounded like nothing. A teenage girl with a cold, a bit of congestion. But I had been listening to that whistle for 14 years, and I knew exactly what it meant. Her inhaler was almost empty. 2 doses left, maybe 3 if she was careful. After that, I would have to watch my 14-year-old sister fight for air with nothing in my hands but a $5 bill and a prayer. I wasn't much for praying. The system had taught me a long time ago that prayers don't pay for medicine. 11 years. That's how long Della and I had been wards of the state of Ohio. 7 different foster homes, 3 different schools in 3 different counties. A folder of paperwork thicker than a Bible, none of it adding up to anything you could call a life. Our mother died when I was 6 and Della was 3. A November night, a wet road, a man texting his girlfriend instead of watching the red light. The truck driver walked away with a broken arm and a court date. Our mother walked away into the ground. Her name was Rosalind. I held onto that name the way some people hold onto crosses. 3 days before that bus station, I had walked out of St. Agatha's Home for Children with my 17th birthday hanging around my neck like a noose. The state had decided Della could come with me since I was her only living relative, and she had begged a social worker until she lost her voice. They gave us 2 black garbage bags. They gave us directions to a homeless shelter that had no beds. They gave us nothing else. I sat in that bus station and I scrolled through my cracked phone screen for the better part of an hour, looking at apartment listings and rooming houses, every single one of them asking for things we didn't have. Deposits, references, credit checks, proof of income, proof of life almost. I was about to put the phone away when I saw it. It was buried at the bottom of a county auction page, almost lost between foreclosed properties and seized vehicles. The thumbnail showed a building that looked like it had been abandoned by every decade since the Carter administration. Abandoned roadside diner, Cedar Hollow, Montana. Starting bid $5. Sold as is. No inspection available. Buyer must claim keys in person. I read it 3 times. Then I read it again. The same $5 sitting in my palm. The same $5 that wasn't enough to buy a meal at a real restaurant, wasn't enough to fill the gas tank of a car we didn't own, wasn't enough to do anything at all in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. But out there in some little town in Montana that probably didn't even appear on most maps, that same $5 could buy a building, a roof, walls, a floor, a place where a state social worker couldn't find us, a place where my sister could breathe. I pressed the bid button at 3 in the morning. I didn't tell Della. I didn't want to wake her up just to break her heart when somebody else outbid me. Nobody outbid me. The confirmation email came at 6:23 the next morning, lighting up my cracked screen with words I read 4 times before I let myself believe them. Congratulations. You are the winning bidder. Property parcel 7742 Whitlock's Roadside Diner. Final bid $5. Della stirred against my shoulder. She lifted her head and blinked at me with that look she always had first thing in the morning, half asleep and completely trusting, and I held the phone in front of her face and watched the words slowly register. "Where are we going?" she whispered. "Montana," I said. "We just bought a house." She didn't laugh. She didn't tell me I was crazy. She just looked at me with her tired green eyes, the same eyes our mother had, and she said, "Okay, Harlow, okay." That word, okay. From a 14-year-old girl with 2 doses of medicine left in her inhaler and a sister with $5 to her name. That word held more faith than any sermon I had ever heard. The bus ride took 2 days. 2 days of sleeping, sitting up, eating crackers from vending machines, drinking water from bathroom sinks. 2 days of changing buses in cities I'll never remember the names of, watching America roll past the windows. Cornfields stretching to a horizon that never seemed to come. Towns that appeared and disappeared in minutes, gas stations and water towers and the steeples of small churches. Mountains rising slow in the distance, blue and indifferent. Della pressed her face against the window for hours at a time. Somewhere around the Nebraska line, she turned to me and asked, "What do you think it looks like?" "What?" "Our diner." She was already calling it ours, already building a kitchen in her head, already setting tables, already imagining a life we hadn't earned yet. I should have warned her. I should have told her that $5 doesn't buy you anything except the right to feel foolish later. I should have prepared her for the rubble we were probably going to find, but she was looking at me with her face lit up like a candle, and something inside me just couldn't blow it out. "I don't know, Della," I said. "I guess we'll find out." In Wyoming, somewhere outside of Cheyenne, an older man boarded the bus and sat down across the aisle from us. He was probably 65, maybe 70, with a weathered face and the kind of hands that looked like they had built barns. He saw Della's inhaler. He saw the garbage bags at our feet. He didn't say a word about any of it. When we stopped at a rest area, he came back from the vending machines with 2 sandwiches, 2 apples, and 2 bottles of water. He set them down on the empty seat next to me and said, "My daughter used to have asthma. Took us a long time to figure out the right medicine. Just take it. I already ate." He hadn't already eaten. I could tell by the way his stomach growled when he sat back down. But he had nothing else to offer 2 girls he didn't know, and his pride wouldn't let him give us money. So he gave us food and a lie, and he never said another word to us for the rest of the ride. That was the first time in a very long time that a stranger had been kind to me. I sat there with that sandwich in my lap, and I thought about all the times I had decided that the world was made up of 2 kinds of people, the ones who hurt you and the ones who looked the other way. I had been wrong. There was a 3rd kind. I just hadn't met enough of them yet. We got to Cedar Hollow, Montana on a gray afternoon in early November. The bus dropped us at a gas station on the edge of town and rolled away without ceremony. We stood in the parking lot with our garbage bags and our last $6.43, and we looked down a main street that seemed to belong to another century. Cedar Hollow had 1,400 people according to the welcome sign. I counted maybe a dozen walking the sidewalks, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign, a feed store with sacks of grain stacked in the window, a small cafe with red booths visible through dusty glass, The buildings hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration, and every single person we passed turned to look at us as we walked by. Two teenage girls with garbage bags slung over their shoulders. We looked exactly like what we were. The county clerk's office sat between the post office and a barber shop with a striped pole that didn't spin anymore. The woman behind the counter was named Doris, according to a small plaque on her desk. She was about 60, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up when we walked in, and I watched her expression shift from boredom to something much harder to name. Something like pity, but with a sharper edge. "Can I help you girls?" she asked. I set my crumpled $5 bill on the counter, the bill I had stared at for 2 days across half a continent, the bill that had bought us a building. "We're here for the keys to the Whitlock Diner." Her eyebrows climbed so high they nearly touched her hairline. She looked at the $5 bill, then at me, then at Della, then back at me. She did not pick up the money. "You're the ones who bought that place." "Yes, ma'am." "How old are you?" 17. "And her?" 14. "She's my sister." Doris's mouth pressed into a thin white line. She pulled open a drawer and lifted out a manila envelope, but she didn't hand it to me. She held it against her chest and studied us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You girls have somewhere to stay if this doesn't work out. Anyone you can call?" "No, ma'am." "Family in the area?" "No, ma'am." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a truck rumbled past, kicking up dust on the empty street. Inside that little office with the radiator clicking and the wall clock ticking and that silver-haired woman holding our future against her cardigan, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt seen. She finally set the envelope on the counter. "The property is 4 miles east of town off the old highway. New interstate bypassed this whole area back in the 90s. That's why nobody comes through anymore. That's why the diner closed." She paused. Thaddeus Whitlock owned the place. I worked at that diner the summer of '79 when I was a girl. We all did, more or less. "What was he like?" Della asked. It was the first thing she'd said since we walked in. Doris took a long breath, and for a second, I thought she might cry. "He was the kind of man this country used to make on purpose, and then forgot how." She slid the keys across the counter. "Good luck, girls. You're going to need it." We walked those 4 miles in the late afternoon sun. The road wound through farmland and pine forest, past fields gone to seed and farmhouses with collapsing roofs. The further we got from town, the quieter the world became. Just the crunch of our footsteps on gravel, the whisper of wind through dry grass, and Della's breathing beside me. The whistling had gotten worse. I told myself it was the cold air. I told myself a lot of things during that walk. We saw the sign first. It rose out of the weeds beside the road, leaning at an angle that suggested it had given up on standing straight a long time ago. The neon tubing was dark and cracked. The metal frame had rusted into a deep orange, but the words were still readable, painted bold on a curved white panel. Whitlock's Roadside Diner. Open 24 hours. Someone had nailed a piece of plywood over the words, "Open 24 hours." Someone had painted "Closed" on the plywood. Time and weather had faded the paint to a ghost. Beyond the sign, sitting in the middle of a gravel parking lot that had more weeds than gravel, was the building that had cost me $5. It was smaller than I had pictured. One story, rectangular with big windows along the front and a chrome strip along the roofline that had gone the color of old nickels. The white paint was peeling. The roof sagged just slightly in the middle. One of the windows had been boarded up, but the walls were straight. The foundation looked solid, and parked beside the building, half hidden under 15 years of dust and pine needles, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. A 1969 Ford pickup truck, faded blue, the chrome on the bumper still bright underneath the grime. Della grabbed my arm. "Wave, it's real! It's actually real!" I pulled the keys from the envelope, 2 brass keys on a simple ring. My hands were shaking by the time I got the front door open. The lock turned with effort, and the door swung inward with a long, slow creak, releasing the breath of 15 years. The smell hit first. Dust and old grease and wood that had been baking in summer heat and freezing through Montana winters for 15 straight years. Something sweet underneath, something organic, maybe rotting cloth, maybe the memory of pies, maybe just the smell of a place that had been waiting too long. But underneath all of that, I caught something else, something I didn't have a word for until much later. Possibility. The late afternoon light poured through the dirty windows in long golden shafts, illuminating 10,000 particles of dust, hanging in the air undisturbed for a decade and a half, until 2 girls from Ohio walked through the door. The booths along the walls were upholstered in red vinyl, cracked but not split. A long counter stretched across the back with chrome stools bolted to the floor. Behind the counter, a pass-through window opened into the kitchen. Coffee cups were stacked upside down near a cash register that looked older than Doris. Salt and pepper shakers stood at attention on every table. Menus were stacked beside the register, their corners curled. It was a time capsule, a perfect little museum of a moment somebody had walked away from. Della moved slowly down the center aisle, trailing her fingers through the dust on the booth backs. Her eyes were wider than I had seen them in years. "It's like a movie set," she whispered. I stepped behind the counter and opened a cabinet. Stacks of plates wrapped in newspaper that had yellowed to amber. Cups and saucers, silverware, and trays, all carefully packed. Whoever had closed this place hadn't abandoned it. They had preserved it. Like a man laying flowers on a grave he expected to come back and visit. "Wave. Look." Della was standing at the far end of the counter, pointing at the wall above a small framed photograph. I walked over to see. The photograph was black and white, faded, but still clear. A man in a denim work shirt and dark trousers stood in front of the diner, with one hand resting on the hood of that same Ford pickup. Young, maybe early 30s, tall and lean with serious eyes that didn't quite hide the pride underneath. Beneath the photo, engraved on a small brass plate, Thaddeus Whitlock, opening day, May 14th, 1978. I looked at that man in the photograph for a long time. He didn't know me. He had never known me. He had been dead by my best guess for at least a year. But standing there in the diner he had built with his own hands, with the dust of his absence still settling around me, I felt the strangest thing. I felt watched, not in a frightening way. In a way that I hadn't felt since I was a very small girl, and my mother used to stand in the doorway of my bedroom while I tried to fall asleep just to make sure I got there safe. We should have left right then. We should have driven or walked or hitchhiked back to Cleveland. Two teenage girls with no money and no plan had no business in a place like this full of ghosts we didn't understand. But Della was already standing in the kitchen doorway peering inside, and I followed her. The kitchen was bigger than I expected. A massive steel griddle along one wall flanked by two industrial fryers, a row of refrigerators with their doors hanging open and their interiors dark, a prep station with cutting boards still in place, a dishwashing area with a sink the size of a bathtub. Shelves lined every wall holding equipment I couldn't even identify. Everything was dusty. Everything was intact. "Wave," Della said slowly. "If we clean this up, we could actually—" She trailed off. But I knew what she was thinking. We could actually run this place. We could actually live here. We could actually make a life. It was the most absurd thing I had ever thought. Two teenage girls. No experience. No money beyond what was hidden in our shoes. No legal authority to do anything. But standing in that kitchen with the late afternoon sun coming through the back window and the smell of a place that hadn't been forgotten so much as paused absurd didn't feel impossible. Then I noticed the floor. Most of the kitchen was covered in standard commercial tile off-white and scuffed. But in one corner, partially hidden behind the largest refrigerator, the tile was different. Newer, cleaner. Like somebody had replaced a section of floor and never finished tiling around it. "Help me move this," I said. It took both of us, leaning our shoulders into the side of that refrigerator, scraping it slowly across the floor until it cleared the corner. And there, in the center of that newer tile set, flush with the floor, was a metal handle. Della's breath caught. "Is that a trapdoor?" I knelt down. The metal was cold in my palm, smooth from being used 1,000 times by hands much bigger than mine. I pulled. Nothing. I adjusted my grip and pulled harder. There was a click, and the section of floor lifted, revealing a dark opening below. A staircase, concrete, descending into a darkness that smelled different from the rest of the building, cooler, drier, cleaner, like the air down there had been sealed away from time itself. I looked at Della. She looked at me. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, and I started down the stairs. The beam of my phone cut through the darkness, illuminating concrete walls and metal shelving that climbed almost to the ceiling. I reached the bottom and stopped breathing. The room was huge, much bigger than the kitchen above it, much bigger than I had any right to expect. The ceiling was maybe 8 feet, supported by thick concrete pillars at regular intervals. Metal shelving units lined every wall, stretched all the way around, and ran in double rows down the middle, and every single shelf was full. Canned goods. Cases and cases of canned goods neatly labeled, their dates of purchase written on each lid in black marker. Boxes of dried food. Cases of bottled water. Medical supplies still sealed in plastic. Blankets and sleeping bags in vacuum-packed bricks. Portable stoves. A propane generator the size of a small car hooked into what looked like a ventilation system. Fuel containers stacked in a corner color-coded. Batteries. Flashlights. A hand-crank radio. Tools of every kind hanging from pegboards. This wasn't a basement. This wasn't a root cellar. This wasn't even a survival pantry. This was a fortress. A man had built a fortress beneath a diner, and he had spent most of his adult life stalking it. "Wave." Della's voice came from behind me, small and trembling. She had followed me down the stairs and was standing beside a metal desk pushed against the far wall. A green-shaded lamp sat on the desk surface, dust thick on the glass. Beside the lamp, a stack of papers and a thick leather journal. I walked over slowly. The journal cover was worn soft, the leather darkened from years of being touched by the same hands. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and careful, the ink slightly faded but still readable. If you're reading this, then you found the basement. I don't know who you are. I don't know how you came to own this place. But if you're reading these words, then you're the person I've been waiting for. My name is Thaddeus Whitlock. I built this diner in the spring of 1978, and I built this room in the years that followed. I spent 40 years preparing for a day that might never come. In the summer of 1964, I was 16 years old. The Sun River broke its banks in the worst flood Montana had ever seen. I lost my mother and my younger sister in that flood. I lost the house I grew up in. I lost the part of myself that ever expected the world to give a warning before it took something from you. I promised myself, standing in the rubble of my childhood, that I would never let my community be caught unprepared again. Some people thought I was crazy for building this room. Maybe they were right. But I saw what happens when people are caught with nothing. I will not be the man who watched and did nothing. I am old now. Too old to keep this place running. Too old to wait anymore. So I am leaving it to whoever comes next. I am trusting that the right person will find their way here when the time is right. If that person is you, then welcome. Use this place well. Thaddeus Whitlock, 2022. I turned the page, and I turned the next page, and I read the last entry written 18 months before two girls from Ohio walked through the front door. I can feel it coming now, that quiet, just before the end. My heart isn't what it used to be. There's only so long a man can argue with time. I have one regret. I never found her. Rosalind. The girl who worked here in the summer of 2004. I came to love her like a daughter. She left one day and never came back, and I spent every year since trying to find her. The private investigator I hired finally gave me the answer last spring. She was killed in a car accident in Ohio 11 years ago on a wet November road. She had 2 daughters. The records are sealed. The system is closed to me. I have no legal claim. I have no blood. I have nothing but the memory of a girl who needed help and the love I felt for her like she was my own. So I am leaving this place the only way I know how, with a $5 auction and a prayer that somehow, somewhere, the right hands will find these keys. If you are reading this, whoever you are, know that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. This place was built for you, even if I never got to meet you. I closed the journal. My hands were shaking so hard I had to set it down on the desk. Della was watching me, her face pale in the lamplight. I tried to speak and couldn't. I tried again. What does it say, Wave? What does it say? I couldn't answer. My throat had closed. My eyes had filled with something I had been refusing to feel for 11 years. $5, 2,000 miles. A diner that nobody else had wanted, a man I had never met. A journal that had been waiting for me longer than my sister had been alive. Our mother's name was Rosalind. She had worked at this diner the summer of 2004. He knew her, I finally whispered. Della. He knew Mama. Della's hand reached out and gripped mine so tight I thought she might break my fingers, and the two of us stood in that bunker with the lamp casting long shadows on the concrete walls, and I let myself cry for the first time in years. Not because I was sad, not because I was scared, because somewhere out there a man I had never met had loved my mother. A man I had never met had spent his last years searching for me. A man I had never met had built me a home and waited for me to find it. We slept in the bunker that night. I got the generator started after 3 failed attempts, and the underground room came alive with soft electric light and warm circulating air. We pulled vacuum-sealed sleeping bags from the shelves and made a small camp beside Thaddeus's desk. Della fell asleep almost immediately. I sat up for hours reading earlier entries in the journal. Thaddeus had been meticulous. Every can of food was cataloged. Every piece of equipment had a maintenance schedule. He had even left instructions for the diner upstairs, which pipes were prone to freezing, which sections of the roof needed attention every spring. He had thought of everything, like he had known somehow that 2 teenage girls with no experience would one day need exactly this. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Not in the diner above us, out on the gravel of the parking lot. Quiet, careful steps moving slowly along the perimeter of the building. They paused near the front door. They paused near the boarded-up window. They moved toward the back. I sat very still on top of my sleeping bag, my hand on Della's shoulder. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Long enough that I started to think I had imagined it. Then they started again, moving away, this time fading into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came gray and cold. I climbed the stairs out of the bunker into a kitchen washed in pale November light, and I found a broom in a closet and started to sweep. By the time Della came up rubbing her eyes, I had cleared most of the front room. By noon, the diner actually looked like a place where people might sit down. By 2 o'clock, I had the old coffee maker running, and the smell that filled the building was the best thing I had experienced since I could remember. That was when I heard the truck. It came down the gravel road, slow an engine that sounded like it had been running since the Reagan administration tires popping on loose stones. I stepped out the front door just as a battered green Ford pulled to a stop beside Thaddeus's old pickup. The man who climbed out was at least 75. Tall and thin, white hair sticking out at angles, wearing overalls over a plaid flannel shirt. His boots were caked with mud, and his eyes were the color of denim that had been washed too many times. He looked at me. Then he looked at the diner. Then he looked back at me, and something shifted in his face like a man recognizing a face he had seen before in a dream. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "Somebody finally bought the place." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. He walked closer, taking in the swept parking lot, the cleaned windows, the front door I had propped open to air out 15 years. "Name's Roy Cantrell," he said. "I run the general store in town. I was Thaddeus Whitlock's friend for 40 years. I was here the day he locked these doors and walked away. I always wondered what would happen when somebody finally came back." He looked at me sharper now, studying. "What's your name, girl?" "Harlow," I said. "Harlow Mercer." His face went very still. "Mercer," he repeated. "Your mother. What was her name?" The world narrowed. "Rosalind Mercer." Roy Cantrell stood in that gravel lot for a long time without moving. His mouth opened. It closed. His eyes filled. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as a gravel road. "Sweet Jesus, you look just like her. Same eyes, same chin. I knew it the second I saw you out the window of that store this morning, but I told myself I was an old fool, my mind playing tricks." He reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it and slid a photograph from behind a credit card, black and white, faded with 20 years of being carried. He held it out to me with hands that trembled. A young woman stood in front of the diner wearing a white apron and a smile that looked like the sun coming up. She was 20 years old. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Her hand was raised in a small wave at whoever was holding the camera. I knew that face. I had one photograph of my mother, just one, and it showed that same smile. Thaddeus took this on the day he hired her, Roy said quietly. Kept it in his wallet for 20 years after she left. I kept the copy. He never stopped looking for her, Harlow, not for a single day. I tried to say something. I couldn't. Roy Cantrell looked at me with eyes the color of the Montana sky in November, and he said the words that broke me wide open. He loved her like she was his own. And then he set up that whole damn auction so the only kind of person desperate enough to come for it would be exactly the kind of person who needed it most. $5, 2,000 miles, a test, Harlow. He set it up as a test. I looked at the diner, at the sign, at the dusty Ford pickup that had been waiting in the lot for 15 winters. He knew we'd come. Roy smiled, and there was something in that smile I hadn't seen on a grown man's face in a very long time. Something tender, something proud. He hoped, sweetheart. Every single day until the end, he hoped. That night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Della's breathing got worse. I stood at the window of the diner, watching the sky go black, listening to the wind start to rise off the eastern fields, and I knew without anyone telling me that something was coming. Not just weather, something else. I didn't see the SUV until it was already turning into the gravel lot. It was black, polished, expensive. The kind of vehicle that did not belong on a road like this. It rolled to a stop next to Thaddeus's old Ford, and the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out into the dying light, who looked like she had never touched a piece of dust in her life. Behind me, Della whispered, "Wave. Who is that?" I didn't answer, because I already knew. Whatever Thaddeus Whitlock had built, whatever he had hidden, whatever he had hoped his $5 auction would protect, it had just walked into the parking lot wearing a $1,000 coat, and it was looking right at me. The woman in the black coat stood beside her SUV for a long moment without moving, the way a hawk stands on a fence post before it decides which field to hunt. She was somewhere in her mid-50s with blonde hair cut in a sharp bob that did not move in the Montana wind. Her makeup was perfect. Her boots were the kind of boots that had never walked on gravel until that very afternoon. Her eyes were the color of pale ice, and they were locked on me through the diner window. The passenger door opened. A young man climbed out. He was 25 or 26, dark hair, plain coat, the look of a man who would rather have been anywhere else. He glanced at his mother and then at the diner, and I watched him swallow. The third door opened. A sheriff's cruiser had pulled in behind them, and Sheriff Cole Briggs unfolded himself out of the driver's seat with the slow patience of a man who had been called in to referee something he had no interest in refereeing. He was a big man. Broad shoulders, gray at the temples, a face that had been sunburned and wind-chapped for so many decades, it had settled into a permanent kind of weather of its own. I stepped out onto the front step of the diner. Della stayed inside. I had told her to. The woman in the coat walked toward me with her boots crunching on the gravel like she resented every stone she had to step on. She stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that did not belong out here. "Are you the one," she said, "who bought this property?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied me. up and down. The way a buyer studies a horse she has no intention of paying full price for. How old are you? 17. And you live here? For 3 days now. Something tightened in her jaw. I watched her throat move as she swallowed whatever she actually wanted to say. My name, she said, is Vivian Whitlock Reeve. Thaddeus Whitlock was my grandfather. This diner, this land, this property, all of it belongs to my family. Whatever paperwork you signed, whatever auction you participated in, was conducted while I was sorting out my grandfather's estate. It is invalid. I have already filed a motion in district court. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, I will have you removed. The young man behind her shifted. He looked at the ground. Mom, he said quietly, maybe we could. Bennett. Her voice cut him off without even turning her head. Not now. Sheriff Briggs took a slow step forward, his hands resting on his belt. Mrs. Reeve, he said. His voice was calm but tired. Like I said in the cruiser, this isn't the place to sort out a legal matter. Whatever your court filing is, the courts will handle it. This is a young woman with a deed. This? Vivian said, her eyes never leaving mine, is a squatter, and squatters do not have rights. I did not look away from her. I had spent too many years in foster homes being looked at like that, like a problem someone was going to solve. I had learned a long time ago that the only thing harder than meeting that look was breaking it first. The auction was public, I said. The deed is registered. I have the paperwork in the building behind me. If you'd like to challenge it in court, ma'am, that's your right. But until a judge tells me otherwise, this is my home. Her mouth pressed into a flat white line. You have no idea, she said, what you have walked into. She turned. Her boots ground the gravel as she walked back to the SUV. Bennett lingered for a second, his eyes meeting mine. Something in his expression, something almost like an apology. Then he followed his mother. Sheriff Briggs watched them go, and once their doors had shut and the engine had started, he turned to me. You all right? Yes, sir. He nodded slowly. He looked at the diner. He looked at the old Ford pickup. He looked at me again, and there was something working behind his eyes that I could not read. I'm going to give you a piece of advice, Miss Mercer. Vivian Whitlock Reeve is a woman who is used to getting what she wants. She has lawyers, and they are very good lawyers. You'll need a lawyer of your own. I don't have any money for a lawyer. He nodded again, slow. I figured. I'm going to make a phone call tonight. There's a man in Bozeman who owed Thaddeus Whitlock a favor 25 years ago. He never got the chance to repay it. I think he'd be interested in repaying it now. He climbed into his cruiser and drove out behind the SUV. I stood on the step until both sets of taillights had disappeared down the old highway, and then I went back inside and I locked the door behind me. That was the night the trouble started for real. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of glass breaking. Not loud, not a smashing, a single sharp crack from the back of the diner, the way a window sounds when somebody has wrapped a fist in a coat and pushed through carefully. I sat straight up in the sleeping bag. Della was beside me in the bunker, still asleep, her breath whistling soft and steady. I picked up the heaviest flashlight I could find, a long black mag light that weighed about as much as a hammer, and I climbed the stairs. I did not turn it on. I crept across the kitchen in the dark. The pass-through window into the dining room was a pale rectangle of moonlight. I stopped at the edge of the wall and listened. Footsteps. Inside. Slow. Deliberate. Walking down the center aisle of the diner. Stopping. Walking again. the sound of a hand running along the back of a booth, a long, slow exhale. He was tall. I could tell by the rhythm of his footsteps. A big man. He moved with the patience of someone who knew nobody upstairs was going to call the police because there was no upstairs and the nearest house was 2 miles away. Then he stopped. I heard him sniff the air. "Coffee," he said quietly, to himself. And then he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just realized that the building he is standing in is not as empty as he had been told. I pressed myself flat against the wall. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The footsteps started moving again, this time toward the front. They paused at the cash register. I heard him pick something up, set it down, pick it up again. Then I heard the front door open and the bell above it jingle softly and the door close and the footsteps fade away across the gravel. I waited 5 full minutes before I moved. When I finally walked into the dining room, the back window was busted-out glass scattered across the floor. The cash register drawer had been pulled open, but there was nothing in it. We had not opened. There was nothing to take. On the counter where I had set our deed paperwork that afternoon, somebody had left a single object. A bullet. A rifle round standing on its base, brass and copper gleaming dull in the moonlight. It had not been there when I went to bed. I picked it up with shaking hands and I held it for a long time, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever Vivian Whitlock Reeve was, she was not the only person who wanted us out of this building. The next morning, Roy came by with bread and eggs. He walked through the front door, took one look at the boarded-up back window where I had hammered a piece of plywood at 4 in the morning, and his face went the color of old ash. I showed him the bullet. He held it in his palm, and he stared at it like it was a snake. "Lord have mercy," he said softly. "What does it mean, Roy?" "It means somebody is sending a message." "From Vivian." He shook his head slowly. "Vivian is a lot of things, Harlow. She's mean. She's greedy. She's got a heart that closed up sometime around her 13th birthday and never opened back up. But she's not a woman who hires men with rifles. She has lawyers. She'll bury you in paperwork and court costs. She won't shoot at you." "Then who?" He looked at me for a long time. He set the bullet on the counter. He took off his cap and turned it in his hands. "There's something I haven't told you yet. Something I was waiting until you'd settled in to bring up. But I think we're past waiting now." He sat down on a stool. I sat across the counter from him. "6 years ago," he said, "a company started buying up land along the old highway. They've been doing it slow. A parcel here, a parcel there. They tell folks they want to put in solar panels. They tell other folks it's about a charging station for those electric trucks coming down the line. The truth is, nobody quite knows what they're really after. But they pay good money, and a lot of older folks around here have been happy to sell." "Clear Path Energy," I said. He looked surprised. "You've heard of them. Bennett mentioned them last night, after his mother left." Roy nodded slowly. "Bennett. That boy's got more of his great-grandfather in him than his mother ever did. Listen, Harlow, this diner sits on the last piece of land they need to make their map work. They've been after Vivian to sell ever since Thaddeus passed. She inherited the land north of here, but she couldn't sell that without this parcel attached. She's been telling them she'll deliver it. The problem is Thaddeus's will didn't leave it to her. It left it to a $5 auction, and to whoever showed up." I sat there for a moment looking at the brass and copper bullet on the counter. "How much money is on the table, Roy?" He hesitated. "For Vivian's piece alone, $500,000. The number landed in me like a stone in still water. And if she can't deliver this parcel, then the deal collapses, the whole thing. They walk away. I looked toward the back window where the plywood was nailed up over broken glass. I looked at the rifle round on the counter. I looked at Roy Cantrell's old weathered face. So somebody decided, I said slowly, that scaring 2 teenage girls was easier than fighting them in court. That's how I read it. I picked up the bullet and I closed my fist around it. The metal was cold against my palm. They picked the wrong girls. That afternoon, Bennett Reeve came back. He came alone. He drove a battered tan sedan, not his mother's SUV, and he parked carefully at the edge of the lot. He climbed out with his hands in his pockets. He walked up to the front door and he knocked, even though it was open. I let him in. Della was in the kitchen with Mabel Wexford, who had arrived an hour earlier with a basket of biscuits and a grim look on her face. Mabel had been a waitress at the diner for 15 years before it closed, and Roy had brought her by my second day in town. She was 71, small and wiry, with silver hair in a tight bun, and hands that still remembered every motion of a working kitchen. She had pressed $200 into my palm that first afternoon and told me to buy Della's medicine. I had tried to give it back. She had told me in the firmest voice I had ever heard from a woman her age that I was not taking it. She was giving it. There was a difference. When Bennett walked in, Mabel poked her head out of the kitchen and watched him without saying a word. "Can I talk to you?" Bennett asked me. "Please." I walked outside with him. We stood by the old Ford pickup in the thin November sunlight, with the wind moving slow through the dry grass at the edge of the lot. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he said. "I know how my mother came across yesterday, but I need you to know something. I do not agree with what she's doing." "Then why are you helping her?" "Because she's my mother." He said it simply. "And because I think you deserve to know the truth before this gets worse. It's about to get worse, Harlow." He pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket and handed it to me. "My mother does not care about this diner. She never did. What she cares about is the land it sits on. Clear Path Energy is offering her $500,000 for the combined parcel. They have been pushing her hard for over a year. She cannot sell it without this property attached. That is why she is doing what she is doing." I opened the folder. Email printouts, contract drafts, a signature page unsigned with $500,000 typed in clean black numbers. "Why are you showing me this, Bennett?" He looked at me for a long moment. Up close, he was younger than I had thought yesterday. His eyes were tired the way the eyes of someone who has not been sleeping well get tired. Because my great-grandfather did not spend 40 years building something just to have it paved over for an asphalt parking lot. I read his journals, all of them. Before he died, I spent a lot of weekends sitting beside him in his hospital room, and he told me things he had never told anybody. About this place, about a woman named Rosalind who worked here in the summer of 2004, about 2 little girls he had been trying to find for years. He pulled another piece of paper from his jacket. "This is a copy of his will, the real one, the original, not the version my mother's lawyers have been waving around. Read Article 5. I read it. "I am leaving this property in the manner described above because I believe that homes should not be inherited by blood but by need. My family has never understood what this place represents. They see land and money and potential profit. They do not see the souls who have passed through these doors or the lives that have been changed within these walls. If my granddaughter Vivian, attempts to contest this, will I ask the court to consider the following. I have provided for her generously through other means. She does not need this property, but somewhere out there, someone does. Someone who is lost and scared and looking for a place to belong. This diner was my life's work. I will not see it destroyed. I closed the document. My eyes were wet. Why are you helping me? I asked him again. Because I knew my great-grandfather, really knew him, and this is what he would have wanted. He glanced toward the diner. There's something else, Harlow. The man who has been doing my mother's negotiations with Clear Path. His name is Marcus Hale. He is not a lawyer. He is not a businessman. He is what they call a fixer. He arrives in towns where Clear Path wants land, and he makes the land available, by any means necessary. What does he look like? Tall, maybe 6'4", black hair, late 40s. He wears suits that don't quite fit him right, like he bought them off a rack at a department store and never bothered to have them hemmed. I thought about the slow footsteps in the dark, the big man's stride, the patience of a hunter who knew nobody was going to call for help. He came here last night, Bennett. He went pale. He was inside the building. He left a rifle round on the counter. Bennett closed his eyes. Listen to me, he said quietly. You have to be careful. He has a record, 3 states. I had a private investigator pull it last month when my mother started bringing him to family meetings. He has been arrested for assault in Wyoming, for arson in North Dakota. The charges keep getting dropped. The witnesses keep changing their stories. Nothing ever sticks because Clear Path makes sure nothing sticks. I stood there in the wind, holding a folder of evidence in one hand and the truth in the other. Bennett, I said, why would you go behind your mother's back like this? Why are you on my side? He looked at the diner for a long moment before he answered. Because when I was a kid, before my mother decided I was a disappointment to the family, my great-grandfather used to drive me out here. He'd let me sit at this counter and order whatever I wanted, and he'd tell me about the people who used to come through, the truckers, the travelers, the folks who were running from something. He told me once that this place had saved more lives than he could count. I believed him then. I believe him now, and I am not going to let my mother turn a place that saved lives into a parking lot for a charging station. He drove away after that. I went back inside. Mabel was standing by the counter waiting. She had heard everything. Honey, she said, I think it's time you saw the rest of what Thaddeus left you. What do you mean the rest? She walked behind the counter, opened a drawer below the register, and pulled out an envelope. It had my name on it, handwritten, the same handwriting as the journal. He gave this to me 3 weeks before he passed. He said, when the right person comes for the diner, give them this. I have been carrying it in my apron for 18 months. I opened the envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the bunker. The map showed the layout I already knew, the shelves, the desk, the generator. But in the far back corner, partially hidden behind a row of shelving I had not paid much attention to, there was a small rectangle drawn in red ink. Beneath the rectangle, in the same neat handwriting, 4 words, behind the 3rd shelf. I went down to the bunker that afternoon with Della and Mabel and Roy. The 4 of us pulled the canned goods off the 3rd shelf along the back wall, working slow because the shelf was heavy. We stacked the cans on the floor in neat rows. When the shelf was empty, we leaned our shoulders into it, and we walked it sideways across the concrete floor, the legs scraping with a high metallic shriek. Behind the shelf was a wall, or what looked like a wall. It was concrete block painted the same dull gray as the rest of the bunker, But when I ran my hand along the surface, I felt the difference. The blocks here were a quarter-inch shy of the blocks beside them. There was a seam, a door. Roy ran his fingers along the seam until he found a small recessed handle disguised as a hairline crack. "Old man," he whispered. "You sneaky old man." He pulled. The door swung open with the soft whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing a small room about 6 feet deep, a cell within a cell, and inside that cell stood a freestanding steel safe painted black the size of a small refrigerator. A combination dial gleamed at its center. Della actually laughed, a small, breathless laugh. He had a safe inside the safe. I knelt in front of the dial. I thought about the journal, the way Thaddeus had written about her, the way he had marked one date in the margin over and over on different pages like a man worrying a bruise. Rosalind's birthday, October 19th, 1984. I turned the dial, right to 10, left past 19 all the way around and back to 19, right to 84. I pulled the handle. The safe opened. Inside on the top shelf sat $80,000 in banded cash. I knew it was 80 because the band on top of the stack said so in faded green marker. Beneath the cash sat a leather-bound passbook for an account at the First Bank of Bozeman, dated 2003, in the name of a trust. I opened it. The most recent balance printed on a deposit slip tucked inside was $248,312. The account name read, "The Mercer Sisters Trust." Della made a sound behind me that was not quite a sob. On the second shelf of the safe there was a flat rectangular wooden box. I lifted it out and set it on the floor and opened it. Inside, lying in folded velvet, was a Winchester rifle, older, lever action, the wood worn dark with use, the metal oiled and clean, a box of ammunition beside it, a note tucked in beside the rifle. "If you need to defend this place, defend it, but only if you have to. I am not asking you to be a soldier. I am asking you to be the kind of person I tried to be. Brave when it counts, quiet when it doesn't." On the third shelf of the safe was a single envelope. It was sealed. The wax was the deep red color of old blood. On the front of the envelope, written in Thaddeus's hand, were the words, "For Harlow Mercer. Open when you have already won." I did not open it that day. I closed the envelope inside the safe again, and I closed the safe, and I closed the secret door, and Roy and I pushed the shelf back into place. I took the cash and the passbook upstairs with me. The rifle stayed where it was because I was not yet ready to carry it. That night, Della had her worst attack in a year. She woke up at 4 in the morning, unable to draw a full breath. The whistling had become a high, thin shriek. Her lips were pale. Her fingers were shaking. The new inhaler we had bought with Mabel's money was already half empty after a week. I picked her up. She weighed nothing. I carried her up the stairs of the bunker and out into the cold parking lot, and I climbed into the cab of Thaddeus's old Ford pickup, and I prayed. Roy had shown me how to start it the day before. There was a trick to the choke. He had walked me through it 3 times because he had been worried about something exactly like this. The engine caught on the second try. I pulled out of the lot with my sister in the passenger seat, and her eyes half closed and her fingers gripping the dashboard. The headlights cut through the dark. 30 miles to the nearest hospital. The road wound through pine forest and farmland, and I drove it with both hands locked on the wheel and my foot heavier on the gas than I had ever pressed any pedal in my life. We made it in 22 minutes. The emergency room nurse took one look at Della and called a code. They put her on a nebulizer. They put an IV in her arm. They moved her to a curtained bay, and a doctor came in and listened to her chest with a stethoscope, and his face did something that I did not like. "How long has she been like this?" he asked me. "Like what?" "Untreated. The crackling I'm hearing. The way her chest is moving. This is not a kid who has been on appropriate medication. This is a kid who has been getting by on the cheapest inhaler the pharmacy sells." I looked at the floor. "We didn't have insurance," I said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Della, who was asleep now, the oxygen mask making her face look small. "She needs a specialist," he said. "She needs a controller medication. She needs to be on a treatment plan that costs about $400 a month. Without that, she is going to keep ending up in rooms like this one, and one of these times she is not going to wake up." I sat down in the plastic chair beside her bed. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. The leather passbook was still there, where I had been carrying it all day. "Doctor," I said, "I can pay. Whatever it costs, I can pay." He looked at me and at my sister and at the worn passbook in my hand, and something in his face softened. "All right then," he said. "Let's get her on a plan." We came home from the hospital the next afternoon. Della was tired but breathing easy, with 3 new prescriptions in a bag and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. The bill had been just over $2,000. I had paid it in cash. The cashier in the billing office had looked at me strangely. I had not cared. When we pulled into the gravel lot, Mabel was waiting on the front step. So was Roy. So was Bennett Reeve. And so was a man I had never seen before. The new man was tall, 6'4", at least dressed in a charcoal suit that did not quite hang right on his shoulders. His hair was black. His eyes were a flat brown. He stood at the edge of the lot with his hands in his pockets, and he watched us pull in like a man watching a clock he was waiting for. I knew before Bennett said a word who he was. Marcus Hale. I helped Della out of the truck. I walked her past him without looking at him. I sat her down inside on a booth bench beside Mabel, and Mabel wrapped her arm around my sister and did not say a word. Roy followed me back outside. So did Bennett. The 3 of us faced Marcus Hale across the gravel of the parking lot. He smiled. It was a small smile. Practiced. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I'm Marcus Hale. I represent Clear Path Energy. I think it's time we had a conversation." "About what?" "About the future. About how you walk away from this with your dignity, your sister's medical bills paid, and a check in your pocket that solves every problem you have." "I don't have any problems." "Don't you?" He took a single step closer. Roy shifted beside me. Bennett shifted on my other side. Marcus Hale did not seem to notice either of them. "My company," he said, "is prepared to offer you $50,000 to vacate this property within 48 hours. We will pay all relocation costs. We will provide a positive reference for any landlord you choose. We will set up your sister with a year of premium medical care at a clinic of your choice. $50,000. Miss Mercer is a great deal of money for a young woman in your situation. It is more money than people like you typically see in a lifetime. People like me." He smiled again. "You know what I mean." I looked at him. I looked at the sun setting behind him over the western fields. I looked at the sign that read Whitlock's Roadside Diner, with the ghost of the painted closed still faintly visible underneath the plywood. I thought about a man I had never met who had spent 40 years preparing for a moment exactly like this one. "No," I said. He blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me, Mr. Hale. The answer is no. The answer is no today. The answer is no tomorrow. The answer is no every day after that, until the day I die." His smile stayed in place, but his eyes changed. Something flat became something colder. "Miss Mercer," he said softly, "you are very young. You have no idea what you are walking into." That's the second time someone has said that to me this week. And it will be the last time anyone says it politely. He turned. He walked back to his car, a black sedan parked at the edge of the lot. He climbed in. He sat there for a long moment with the door open, looking back at me, and then he closed the door and drove away. Roy let out a long, slow breath. "Lord Harlow." "He's the one who broke in here, Roy. He's the one who left the bullet." "I know." "He's not going to stop." "No," Roy said. "He is not." That night, after Della was asleep, I went down to the bunker and I opened the safe. I took out the Winchester rifle and the box of shells. I sat down at Thaddeus's desk and I read through the manual that had been folded into the box. I cleaned the rifle by lamplight. I loaded it. I set it on the desk in front of me, and I sat there with it for a long time. Around midnight, I heard the engine. A vehicle coming down the gravel road slow. It pulled into the lot. It stopped. The engine cut. A door opened. Footsteps on gravel moving toward the back of the building this time. I climbed the stairs of the bunker carrying the rifle. I walked through the dark kitchen, through the dining room to the front door. I unlocked it. I stepped out onto the gravel under a sky full of cold November stars, and I walked around the side of the building with the rifle held across my chest, the way Thaddeus had shown me how in a faded photograph in the back of the journal, posed in front of this same diner 40 years ago. Marcus Hale was standing at the back of the building. He had a gas can in his hand. The cap was off. He was pouring fuel along the base of the rear wall, slow and careful, like a man watering a row of seedlings. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. He saw the rifle. He saw me. I did not point it at him. I held it across my chest, the barrel angled at the dirt. I stood about 20 feet from him, with my finger flat alongside the trigger guard, the way the manual had taught me, and I let my voice come out clear and low and steady. "Mr. Hale, step away from the building." He did not move. "Are you going to shoot me, Miss Mercer?" "No, sir. Not unless you give me a reason." "That is a felony. You are pointing at me." "It's not pointed at you. It's pointed at the dirt. And I am standing on my own property defending it from a man who is committing arson. The county sheriff has been informed about you. He has your record. You can put the can down and you can walk away, or you can keep pouring, and we can find out together how the law in Cedar Hollow feels about a man in a suit setting fire to the home of 2 orphaned girls." He stood there for a long moment. The wind moved in the dry grass beyond the parking lot. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once and then stopped. The stars wheeled in their cold, patient circles overhead. Marcus Hale set the gas can down. He held up his empty hands. He took 3 steps backward. He smiled at me one more time, but it was a thinner smile now, a smile with something brittle inside it. "Miss Mercer," he said softly, "you are making a very serious mistake. You drove out here to burn down a child's home, Mr. Hale. I think we both know who's making the mistake." He walked back to his car. He climbed in. He drove away. I stood there in the parking lot until I could not hear his engine anymore. Then I walked over and picked up the gas can and emptied what was left of it onto the gravel far away from the building. I took the rifle inside. I locked the door. I went back down to the bunker, and I sat at Thaddeus's desk, and only then did my hands finally start to shake. The next morning, Sheriff Cole Briggs drove out to the diner. He had a manila folder in his hand. He sat down at the counter and Mabel poured him a cup of coffee, and he set the folder down beside his cup. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I need to tell you something. I should have told you the first day I met you. I didn't because I wasn't sure how I felt about it yet." "About what, Sheriff?" He took a long sip of his coffee. He looked at the photograph on the wall. The black and white photograph of Thaddeus Whitlock standing beside his Ford pickup on the day he opened the diner. In 1985, he said, there was a fire at a barn 3 miles north of town, a bad one. A man was trapped inside. He had a 4-year-old son outside watching it burn. Thaddeus Whitlock had been driving past on his way back from a delivery. He saw the smoke. He stopped. He went into that barn and he carried the man out on his shoulders and he saved his life. That was your father. He nodded slowly. I have spent 40 years, Sheriff Briggs said quietly, trying to figure out how to repay a man who refused to let me thank him while he was alive. He told me once that the only thing he wanted was for me to remember when the time came that he had stood in a fire for somebody who couldn't stand for himself. He pushed the manila folder across the counter to me. This is everything I have on Marcus Hale. 3 states, 4 open investigations, 2 warrants in Idaho that the Idaho boys never bothered to extradite for. I have been on the phone since 5 this morning. The state attorney general's office is interested in him. The federal energy regulators are interested in him. He has been working in this region for 3 years, and you, Miss Mercer, are the first person who has ever stood up to him without backing down. I looked at the folder. What does that mean for me, Sheriff? It means, he said, that you are no longer alone in this fight. He stood up. He drank the last of his coffee. He set the cup down on the counter, and he tipped his hat to me, and he walked toward the front door. At the door, he paused. There's one more thing, Miss Mercer. Yes, sir. There's a storm coming. The biggest one this region has seen in 30 years. It'll be on us inside of 48 hours. The forecast is calling for sustained winds at 60 miles an hour and temperatures dropping to 28 below. The whole county is going to lose power. People are going to die in their homes. He looked at me, and I knew what he was about to say before he said it. Your basement, Miss Mercer. The room Thaddeus Whitlock built. I have lived in this town all my life. I have heard stories about that room since I was a boy. Most folks thought it was a tall tale. A few of us knew better. I looked at him. What are you asking me, Sheriff? I am asking you, he said quietly, if it is what they say it is, and if you are willing to open it, to strangers, to the same town that has spent the last week deciding which side of this fight to stand on, to people who looked the other way when you needed them, to people, Miss Mercer, who do not deserve to be saved by you. I thought about my mother. I thought about Thaddeus Whitlock, 16 years old, standing in the rubble of a flooded house in 1964. I thought about a man who had spent 40 years building a fortress against the unknown and then trusted the universe to deliver it into the right hands. I thought about the answer I was about to give. I gave it. Sheriff Briggs, I said, when the storm comes, you bring them all, every last one, and we will keep the lights on for as many people as this town has. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Just once. Slow and deliberate. Yes, ma'am. He walked out into the November sun. He climbed into his cruiser and he drove away. I stood at the window and watched his cruiser disappear down the old highway, the dust trailing behind it like a long brown ribbon, and I felt the wind start to change. The sky to the west was already darkening. A solid wall of slate-gray cloud was rolling slowly toward us out of the mountains. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees since breakfast. The crows in the field across the road had gone quiet. Behind me, Della stood up from the booth. She walked over. She put her hand on my arm. "Wave," she said quietly. "What do we do now?" I looked out at the storm coming in. I thought about Marcus Hale somewhere out there in the world planning his next move. I thought about Vivian Whitlock Reeve in some hotel in the next county, signing papers she would never get to file. I thought about a small army of strangers somewhere out in the valley who did not yet know that the lights in their homes were about to go out. "Della," I said, "we get ready." The first snowflakes hit the windshield of the old Ford pickup an hour later, slow at first, then faster. By dark, the world outside the diner windows had gone white, and the wind had begun to scream low and steady across the prairie, and somewhere in that howling dark, the storm of a generation was coming for Cedar Hollow, Montana. And we were the ones who had the lights. The power went out at 7:42 in the evening. I remember the time because I had been watching the old wall clock above the counter, the one Thaddeus had hung there in 1978, the one Mabel had wound that very afternoon. The minute hand moved one click. The second hand kept sweeping, and then the lights died. The refrigerator hum cut off, and the world inside the diner went black. Della and I were sitting at a booth near the front window. She had her hand on my arm in the dark. "Wave," she whispered. "I know." I lit the kerosene lantern on the table. The orange flame steadied and grew, and the glass globe filled with that soft, warm light that human beings have been using to push back the darkness since before there were diners or highways or states called Montana. The shadows of 2 girls reached up the walls behind us. Outside, the wind had become a living thing. It pressed against the building with a long, low howl, throwing snow against the glass in waves that sounded almost like surf. The thermometer Roy had nailed to the front porch had read -4 when I last checked it at 6 o'clock. By morning, the radio said it would be 28 below. People were going to die in their homes tonight, unless we let them in. "Della," I said, "get the bag." She nodded. She walked into the kitchen with the lantern, and I followed her down the steps of the bunker. We had spent the entire afternoon preparing. Roy had come with 2 truckloads of firewood and stacked it along the back wall. Mabel had brought every spare blanket and quilt she owned 3 loads in the back of her car, and we had stacked them on the lower shelves. Bennett had driven up with bottled water and propane canisters from the hardware store in town, paying for them out of his own pocket without a word. The 4 of us had set up cots along the bunker walls, 20 cots wedged into every corner we could find. The propane generator started on the first pull this time, the bunker filled with soft electric light and warm air pushing through the vents. I stood at the bottom of the stairs looking at what Thaddeus Whitlock had built, and I thought about a 16-year-old boy in 1964 standing in the rubble of his mother's house with mud on his shoes and a vow forming in his chest. I thought about a promise that took 40 years to keep. The first knock came at 8:17. It was Sheriff Briggs. He stood on the front step with snow caked on his shoulders and ice in his eyebrows, and behind him in the storm, there was an old woman wrapped in a quilt that looked older than I was. Mrs. Delgado from the farmhouse at the edge of the lot, 84 years old, living alone. Her gas furnace had stopped at 5 o'clock. "Bring her in, Sheriff," I said. He brought her in. He carried her, actually, when he saw she could not walk steady on the icy steps. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. We sat her down in a booth by the kitchen, and Mabel wrapped her in 2 more blankets and pressed a cup of warm broth into her shaking hands. The sheriff looked at me. "More are coming, Miss Mercer." "Bring them all, Sheriff." He went back out into the storm. By 9:30, there were 12 people in the diner. By 10:15, 20. By 11:32. They came in waves, pulled from cars, stuck in drifts, pulled from houses where the pipes had already begun to freeze, pulled from a grain silo on the south end of town where 4 farmhands had taken shelter when their truck stalled out. The Martinez family came with 3 small children, the youngest crying from the cold. A young couple I had never seen before came with wind-burned faces and a dog. 2 men who Roy said worked at the lumber mill came with their wives carrying babies wrapped in coats. We brought them all down to the bunker. Della worked beside me the whole time. She was breathing easier now than she had in a year. The new medications doing their work in her lungs, and she moved between the cots with cups of broth and stacks of blankets and the calm presence of a young woman who had finally found something she was good at. When the youngest Martinez child would not stop crying, Della picked up a battered children's book from one of the shelves and sat down on the concrete floor beside the cot, and she began to read out loud. Within 10 minutes, the child had stopped crying. Within 20 minutes, 3 more children had drifted over to listen. By midnight, my 14-year-old sister was sitting in the middle of a half-circle of small bodies wrapped in blankets, reading a story about a horse who lost his way home, and her voice did not shake once. At 20 minutes past midnight, the radio on the desk crackled. It was Sheriff Briggs. He had taken his cruiser out for one more sweep looking for stragglers. His voice came through the static thin and tight. "Miss Mercer, are you there? Over." I picked up the handset. "I'm here, Sheriff. I have a call from County Dispatch. A vehicle off the road 3 miles east of town. Driver did not respond to her phone. The cellular tower is out. A neighbor reported seeing the lights of her car around 8 o'clock and not seeing them since. The car has been off the road for over 4 hours, Miss Mercer. The driver is Vivian Whitlock Reeve." I closed my eyes. The bunker had gone quiet. People were watching me. Roy was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with a coffee pot in his hand. Mabel was on a cot beside Mrs. Delgado, her hand resting on the older woman's wrist. Bennett was at the bottom of the stairs. He had heard the sheriff's voice. His face was the color of paper. "Bennett," I said quietly. "That's my mother." "Yes." He looked at me. I looked at him. There was a moment, very brief, when both of us understood what was about to happen. I keyed the radio. "Sheriff Briggs, I am coming with you." "Miss Mercer, the wind chill out there is 60 below. The visibility is under 5 feet. I cannot guarantee." "I know what you cannot guarantee, Sheriff. I am coming. I will bring 2 more men with me. We need ropes, headlamps, and the warmest clothes anybody can spare. I will meet you at the front of the building in 10 minutes. I hung up the radio. The bunker was silent, except for the soft hum of the generator. Della was watching me. So was every other person in that room. I looked at Della. I did not have to say anything. She knew. She had known me her entire life. She looked at me with our mother's green eyes, and she gave me one small, slow nod, and that was the only permission I needed in the world. I went upstairs to put on every layer of clothing I owned. We tied ourselves together with a length of climbing rope Roy had pulled from the hardware store storage room. Sheriff Briggs in front, then me, then Bennett, then Frank from the lumber mill, then Dale from the auto shop. 5 of us lashed nose to tail like a chain of mountain climbers, with headlamps strapped to our foreheads and snow goggles fogging on our faces. We stepped out into the storm, and the storm hit us like a freight train. I had thought I knew what cold was. I had grown up in Cleveland, Ohio. I had stood at bus stops in February with no gloves. I had walked to school with ice in my hair. I had 3 days ago slept in a foster home with a broken radiator and woken up to frost on the inside of the window. I had not known what cold was. This cold was not weather. This cold was a hand reaching into your body and pulling at your bones. It got under the layers under the skin, into the spaces between joints and ligaments. The wind drove tiny needles of ice into every patch of exposed face. The snow was coming down so thick I could not see Bennett behind me on the rope, and he was 3 feet away. We walked east along what we hoped was the road. Sheriff Briggs led with a compass and a county map laminated against the snow. The drifts came up to our knees, then our thighs in the low spots. Every step was a fight against an invisible current. The cold settled into my fingers first, and then my feet, and then a numb dullness that started to climb up my calves. I knew that was bad. I knew that meant the small blood vessels were closing down. I kept walking. We had been out for 55 minutes by Sheriff Briggs's watch when Frank shouted from the back of the line. I turned. He was pointing at something off to the right half, buried in a drift. A tail light. Just one. The other was buried. It was glowing dull red, its battery dying. We followed the rope to it. The black SUV was on its side halfway into a drainage ditch, its front end crumpled against a fence post. The driver's window was down, snow piled on the inside of the door. The driver's seat was empty. "She got out," Sheriff Briggs said. "How far could she have gone?" "Not far." We spread out as far as the rope would let us. We swept the area with our headlamps calling her name. The wind ate our voices. After 10 minutes, after 15 minutes, after 20 minutes, I had begun to make peace with what I was about to find. A woman who had spent the last week trying to take everything from me, frozen in a snowbank, because her vehicle had failed her in a storm, while I stood 20 yards away looking at her dead face. Then I saw the dark shape in the ditch. She was 30 feet from the SUV, curled into a ball at the bottom of a steep slope. She was not moving. The snow had begun to cover her. Another 20 minutes, maybe 30, and she would have been a soft white shape that nobody would have found until spring. I scrambled down the slope on my heels. I knelt beside her. I pulled my glove off with my teeth and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. A pulse, faint, slow, but there. "She's alive," I shouted up the bank. "She's alive!" Her skin was the color of wet paper. Her lips were blue. I unzipped my coat and pulled it off in the snow and wrapped it around her shoulders, and I lifted her in a fireman's carry the way I had once watched a paramedic do on a training video at a community center in Cleveland. She weighed less than I had expected. Bennett scrambled down the slope to help me. Together we got her up the bank, across the snow, and onto the rope line where Sheriff Briggs and Frank could take her weight. We carried her back to the diner. The walk took 40 minutes longer than the walk out. Bennett cradled his mother's head against his shoulder the entire way, his face inside the hood of his coat, fixed in something I would not be able to name for years afterward. The wind pushed against us all. The cold gnawed at us all. My fingers had stopped hurting somewhere on the return trip, which I knew was a worse sign than the pain had been. By the time we stumbled through the front door of the diner at 2:15 in the morning, I could not feel my hands at all. The bunker erupted in motion. Mabel had been a nurse's aide in the 1970s, and she took over with a quiet authority that surprised even Sheriff Briggs. She had Vivian wrapped in 3 blankets and laid on a cot near the propane heater within 90 seconds. She stripped off the wet clothing. She placed warm water bottles pre-prepared against Vivian's neck and armpits and the femoral arteries on the inside of her thighs. She held her own ear close to Vivian's mouth and counted breaths. I sat against the concrete wall of the bunker, with my fingers in lukewarm water in a soup bowl, watching the color slowly come back into them. Della sat beside me, holding the bowl steady, her face wet. Bennett sat on the cot beside his mother. He had not said a word since we had brought her in. Vivian Whitlock-Reeve did not wake up for 6 hours. Around 8 in the morning, with the storm finally beginning to break, and the sky outside the diner windows turning a pale bleached blue, her eyes opened. I was sitting on a cot across from her, holding a cup of coffee I had not yet tasted. The bunker was full of sleeping people, soft snores, the occasional cough, the murmured voices of children waking up under blankets that had once belonged to strangers. Mabel had told me to call her if anything changed. Vivian's eyes opened. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the concrete walls. She looked at the metal shelves stacked with cans and water bottles, and her face slowly registered where she was. She turned her head. She saw me. "Where am I?" she whispered. Her voice was a paper rasp. "You are in your grandfather's bunker, Mrs. Reeve. We brought you here last night. You were stranded in your vehicle 3 miles east of town." She closed her eyes for a long time. When she opened them again, they were wet. "Did you bring me here?" "Sheriff Briggs and I and a few other men." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" The question was barely a sound. I could see her trying to work through it, trying to put together the math of why a 17-year-old girl whose home she had been trying to seize would walk into a storm to save her life. "Because," I said, "this is what the room was built for." Her face did something that was not quite weeping. It was something older than weeping, something a human being only does when the version of themselves they have been carrying around for 50 years is finally too heavy to keep holding. She reached into the pocket of the coat we had laid across her chest. Her fingers came out holding a folded piece of paper. The paper was wrinkled and damp, but the writing was still readable. She held it out to me with a hand that shook. "Bennett gave me this," she said, "before I left Bozeman. He gave it to me 3 days ago. I did not read it. I told him I was too busy. I told him I would read it later. I put it in my coat pocket, and I forgot about it. I read it last night, Miss Mercer. I read it in the car after my engine failed. I read it 3 times waiting for help that wasn't coming. I read it watching my breath fog in the air and wondering if I was going to die out there." I took the paper from her hand. I unfolded it. The handwriting was Thaddeus's. "Vivian, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are probably doing exactly what I hoped you would not. You are fighting over the diner. You are trying to take what I left for someone else. I know you are angry. I know you feel like I chose strangers over family. I need you to understand something. When your mother was born, I was so proud. I had everything I wanted: a business, a wife, a daughter, a future. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what mattered. I built this place when I should have been building a relationship with your mother. By the time I noticed, she was 12, and I was a stranger to her. By the time she was 17, she had stopped speaking to me. By the time she was 25, she had a daughter of her own, and I was not invited to meet her. That daughter was you. I am not proud of what I let happen, Vivian. I have spent the last 40 years regretting it. I cannot change the past. I can only try to make the future better than I made the past. This diner is not about money. It is not about property values. It is not about an investment. It is about giving people a chance, a place to belong, a home when they have nowhere else. Your mother had everything she needed. She never had to struggle. She never had to wonder where her next meal was coming from. That was a gift, and I am glad I could give it to her even when she stopped letting me give her anything else. But there are other people in this world who are not so lucky. People who need exactly what this place can offer. People like Rosalind, the girl who worked here years ago. People like her daughters, wherever they are. If you are reading this, I hope you will understand. And I hope when the time comes, you will let them have this one thing. I love you, Vivian. Even when you wouldn't let me. Your grandfather, Thaddeus. I folded the letter. My hands had stopped shaking. Vivian was looking at me with eyes that had become a different color in the last 6 hours. Whatever ice had lived there before was gone. What was left was just water. I did not know, she whispered, about the girl who worked here. Her name was Rosalind. Yes, she was my mother. She closed her eyes again. A long, slow tear rolled down the side of her face into the blanket. My God, she said. He found you. After all those years, he actually found you. He didn't find me, Mrs. Reeve. He trusted that I would find my way here, and I did. She lay there in silence for a long time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier, older, more tired. Miss Mercer, I will withdraw the lawsuit. I will withdraw it tomorrow morning. I will tell my lawyers that any claim I made against this property is rescinded in full with apology. I will pay your legal costs. I will make any restitution you require. I will. She stopped. She breathed. She tried again. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of woman my grandfather hoped I could be. Whether I succeed at that or not is not your problem. But I will never trouble you again. I did not know what to say. So I reached out and I took her hand. Her fingers were cold and thin and old, and they closed around mine the way a frightened child's fingers close. We stayed like that for a long time. Outside, the wind had finally begun to die. The storm broke at noon. The clouds parted and the sun came through, and the world outside the diner became a country of diamonds. 3 feet of new snow lay over everything. The drifts in the parking lot were taller than I was. Sheriff Briggs and a county plow operator who had ridden out the storm in his truck spent the afternoon clearing a path down to the highway. By dinner time, the power had come back on across most of the county. People began to leave the bunker in groups going home to assess what the storm had done to their houses, to their barns, to their lives. Each one of them stopped to thank us before they left. Mrs. Delgado kissed Della on the forehead. The Martinez children gave her a drawing of a horse. Frank from the lumber mill shook my hand and held it longer than he needed to. The young couple I had not met before introduced themselves as David and Emma. They told me they had been planning to drive out of town that morning. They had been planning to start over somewhere else. They had changed their minds. By 8 o'clock that evening, the bunker was empty again. Just me, Della, Mabel, Roy, Bennett, and his mother, who had asked quietly if she could stay one more night before she went back to Bozeman. The 6 of us sat in a booth, and we ate scrambled eggs and toast and bacon that Mabel had cooked on the diner's old griddle, the first meal that griddle had cooked in 15 years and 3 months. Roy raised his coffee cup. "To Thaddeus Whitlock," he said quietly, "who would have given anything in his life to be sitting in this booth tonight." The rest of us raised our cups. We drank. Sheriff Briggs came by the next morning with news. He stood in the doorway of the diner with his hat in his hand and an expression I had not seen on his face before. Something almost like satisfaction. Something almost like sleep finally caught up with. "Marcus Hale was arrested at the Bozeman airport at 6 o'clock this morning," he said. "He was attempting to board a flight to Houston. The state police picked him up on the warrants from Idaho. Once they had him in custody, the federal energy regulators executed a search warrant on the offices of ClearPath Energy in Denver. They found enough emails and contract drafts to keep a grand jury busy for 2 years. The company's president has already retained criminal defense counsel." I sat down at the counter. Della came over and stood beside me. She put her hand on my shoulder. I covered her hand with mine. "Sheriff," I said, "thank you." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Thank you for doing what Thaddeus would have done. You stood in the fire, Miss Mercer. You did it for me, and you didn't even know you were doing it." He tipped his hat. He walked out. That afternoon, Roy brought me the box. He carried it in slow, holding it the way a man holds something that is not technically his. It was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox with a brass latch tarnished by age. He set it on the counter in front of me. "He gave this to me 18 months ago," Roy said. "About a week before he passed. He told me to hold on to it, and when the time was right, when the right person came, I was to give it to her. I have been keeping it under my bed for 1.5 years, Harlow. I have not opened it. I have not looked inside. He told me it was not for me to see. I looked at the box for a long time. I opened the latch. I lifted the lid. Inside, on a layer of folded cloth, was the photograph of my mother. The same photograph Roy had carried in his wallet, but the original this time in better condition, a little less faded. She was 20 years old. She was smiling. She was holding a coffee pot in one hand and waving with the other, and she looked like she had a future the way people look in photographs taken before they know what is going to happen to them. Beneath the photograph was an envelope. It had 2 names on it: Harlow, Della. I opened it. "My dear girls, if you are reading this, then my plan has worked. I never met you. I do not know what you look like. I do not know what kind of women you are growing up to become. But I knew your mother. And I have spent the last several years of my life believing against all evidence that the daughters of Rosalind Mercer would one day find their way to this diner. I want you to know a few things. Your mother was the brightest person who ever stood behind that counter. She had a laugh that made truckers stop chewing their food just to listen. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the building. She had a kind of strength I have rarely seen in any human being. When she came to me, she was 19 years old and she was running. I do not know what she was running from. I never asked. I gave her a job and a small apartment above the hardware store in town, and the next 4 months of my life were the closest I ever came after I lost my own daughter to having a daughter again. When she left a note. She thanked me. She told me not to follow her. She told me she was going to make a life somewhere far away where the past could not find her. I followed her anyway. I tried for 20 years to find her. I did not find her in time, but I found you. Or rather, I made sure you would find me. This diner is yours now. Not because I gave it to you, but because you came for it. Because you climbed onto a bus with $5 and a sister, and you crossed 2,000 miles, and you opened a door that had been locked for 15 years. You earned this place, the same way she earned a place at this counter when she was 19. There is one more thing I want you to have. Beneath this letter, you will find a key. The key opens a glove box. The glove box belongs to my truck. The truck is yours. Drive it carefully. It is older than your mother was when I met her. I love you both. I have loved you since the day I learned your names. I have loved you across years I never got to share with you, and across miles I never got to cross. Welcome home, your grandfather in every way that matters, Thaddeus Whitlock. I lifted the letter. Beneath it on a small loop of leather was a brass key. The teeth of the key were worn smooth from 40 years of use. Della was reading over my shoulder. Her tears had landed on the paper. I did not mind. I added my own. We sat at that counter, and we cried, the two of us, for a man we had never met, and a mother we had barely known, and a life we had not been promised, but had somehow received anyway. That evening, after Vivian had finally driven back to Bozeman, after Della had fallen asleep on the booth bench, with a quilt pulled up to her chin, I remembered the other envelope, the one in the safe, the one with the wax seal, the color of old blood, the one that read in Thaddeus Whitlock's careful hand, "Open when you have already won." I picked up the lantern. I walked through the kitchen, past the silent griddle, past the refrigerators humming low and steady. I lifted the trap door. I went down the concrete stairs into the room a man had spent 40 years filling with everything two girls might need. I knelt in front of the safe. I turned the dial. October 19th, 1984. The door swung open with the same soft sigh it had given the first time, and I lifted the envelope from the empty top shelf, and I sat down on the cold floor in the lamplight, and I broke the seal. The seal cracked like a small bone. The flap lifted. Inside there was a single sheet of paper. The paper was older than anything else in the safe. It was yellowed at the edges. It had been folded for a long time. But the handwriting on the page was not Thaddeus's. It was my mother's. I had not seen my mother's handwriting since I was 6 years old. There had been a birthday card once kept in a folder of paperwork in a foster home in Akron. The social worker had let me look at it when I was 8, and I had memorized the loops of the letters, and then she had taken it back and put it in a file I never saw again. But I knew that handwriting the way a child knows her own name. My dear friend. The letter began, Thaddeus. I do not know if I will ever send this letter. I am writing it sitting in a motel room in Billings on my way back to Ohio on the last night of the only trip I will ever take back to Cedar Hollow. Tomorrow I will get on a bus and I will go home to my daughters, and I will not return to Montana again. I came back because I needed you to know 2 things. The first is that I am sorry. I left you the way you leave a place when you are too ashamed to stay. I have spent 7 years carrying that shame. I am not going to carry it any more. You loved me like a daughter. I left without saying goodbye. I am sorry, Thaddeus. I am sorrier than these words can hold. The second thing is harder. I am sick. The doctor in Cleveland says it is a small thing that I will be fine, but I have lived long enough to know when something inside you has begun to change its mind about being kind to you. I have 2 daughters now. Their names are Harlow and Della. Harlow is 4 years old and she has my eyes. Della is 1. She is small for her age, and she does not breathe right, and I am afraid for her. I am writing this to ask you a thing I have no right to ask. If something happens to me, if I am gone before they are old enough to take care of each other, if they end up with no one, please find them, Thaddeus. Please. I do not have anyone else in this world to ask. I have spent 7 years running from a past I should have stayed and faced, and the only person I ever knew who would not turn away from a girl with nothing to her name was you. I will not send this letter. I will leave it on the counter when I check out tomorrow morning, and the maid will throw it away, and you will never know I came. That is what I deserve. To be the kind of mother my daughters need, I cannot be the kind of woman who runs back to the only safe place she has ever known. I have to walk into the future on my own feet. But if you ever read these words, Thaddeus, then know this. I named my older daughter Harlow because I wanted her to have a name that sounded like a place where the wind could move through. I named my younger daughter Della because the syllables of it made me think of bells. I named them both for the kind of life I hoped they would have. A life that sounded like music. If anything ever happens to me, give them that life. I love you, old friend. I am sorry. Rosalind. I read the letter 3 times. By the 3rd time, the lantern light had gone soft against the wet of my eyes, and the concrete walls of the bunker had stopped feeling cold, and I understood the last thing I had been waiting 11 years to understand. She had come back. She had been here in this town, on this road, 4 years before she died. She had stood on the same gravel I now stood on. She had looked up at the same sign. And she had decided alone in a motel room in Billings that she could not let herself walk back through the door. She had left the letter on the counter. She had paid her bill. She had gotten on a bus. And somehow, somewhere between her checkout and the maid's morning rounds, that letter had not ended up in a trash bin. It had ended up in the hands of a man who must have driven all the way to Billings the moment he heard she had been there, who must have searched every motel within 20 miles, who must have offered some clerk somewhere $100 bill in exchange for any piece of paper a woman named Rosalind Mercer had left behind. He had found it. He had brought it home. He had put it in his safe, and he had spent the next 13 years of his life keeping a promise to a woman who had never even sent him the letter that asked him to keep it. He had not been guessing. He had not been hoping into the dark. He had not built this place for some abstract child of fate. He had built it for 2 girls whose names he had been carrying around since 2011. He had been keeping the lights on for Harlow. He had been keeping the lights on for Della. I folded the page. I put it back in the envelope. I climbed the stairs of the bunker carrying the lantern, and I walked through the dark kitchen, and I sat down on the booth bench beside my sleeping sister, and I held that envelope against my chest like a heart someone had given back to me. Outside, the Montana sky had gone clear. The stars were sharp and cold. The Ford pickup sat in its place beside the building waiting. Some legacies end. Some are answered. This one had been answered before I was even old enough to know I was lost. 6 months later, the neon sign came back on. It was a Friday evening in late spring. Roy and Bennett had spent 2 weeks rewiring the sign, replacing the cracked tubing with new glass, cleaning 4 decades of dust off the metal frame. They had worked on it after their other jobs, both of them refusing payment, both of them telling me it was the closest thing to time travel either of them had ever gotten to do. When the switch was thrown, the sign came on with a soft electric hum, and every letter glowed. Whitlock's Roadside Diner. Open 24 hours. The plywood and the painted closed were long gone. The original neon, the way Thaddeus had ordered it in 1978, blazed bright against the deepening blue of the Montana sky. I stood in the gravel lot beside Della and Mabel and Roy and Bennett and looked at it. The diner behind us had been transformed. New paint, new windows, a repaired roof, new booths upholstered in red vinyl that we had ordered from a restaurant supply company in Chicago and that Mabel had personally inspected for accuracy. New stools at the counter, the same coffee maker refurbished, the same brass plate beneath the photograph of Thaddeus Whitlock on the wall, polished now until it shone. A new brass plate had been added below the original. Established 1978 by Thaddeus Whitlock, reopened 2024 by Harlow Mercer. Beneath both plates, smaller and quieter, a third inscription, in honor of Rosalind Mercer. We had opened that morning at 6 o'clock. The first customer had been Sheriff Cole Briggs, who had ordered 2 eggs over easy and a side of bacon, and refused to let us comp the meal. The second customer had been Doris from the county clerk's office, who had cried into her coffee cup and not bothered to hide it. By noon, the diner had been full. By 3 o'clock, we had run out of pie. By 5 o'clock, Mabel was teaching Della how to roll a new batch of pie crust the way she had rolled it in 1985. Vivian came at 6. She drove herself from Bozeman in a small sedan that I had not seen before. The black SUV was gone. She wore jeans and a sweater. She ordered apple pie and coffee, and she sat in a booth by the front window for 2 hours, watching the sun set across the western fields. Before she left, she handed me an envelope. I opened it. Inside was a check. $50,000, made out to the Rosalind Mercer Memorial Fund. "What is this?" I said. "It's a contribution," she said. "I've talked to a friend who runs a nonprofit foundation. We've set up a fund. The fund will pay medical bills for any child in this county whose parents cannot afford their care. Asthma medications, diabetes supplies, whatever they need." I looked at her. I looked at the check. I looked at her again. "Mrs. Reeve, my grandfather," she said quietly, "spent 40 years trying to give back to this community. I would like to spend the rest of my life trying to do the same. Will you let me, Miss Mercer? Will you let me try?" I did not say anything. I just stepped out from behind the counter and I hugged her. She stood very still in the hug, the way people do when they have not been hugged in a long time. Then her arms came up slowly, and she held me, and we stood there in the middle of a diner full of people we had both been in different ways trying to save. Della found me out by the sign that night after closing. The lights of the diner were still on inside. Mabel was wiping down the counter. Roy was sitting at a stool drinking decaf. Bennett was washing dishes in the back. The Ford pickup, restored, now polished the chrome bright, again sat in its spot beside the building. New tires, a new battery. The same engine that had carried me 30 miles to a hospital in the middle of the night. The engine that had not failed me yet. It would not fail me. Roy had told me so. Some engines are just built that way. Della came up beside me and slipped her hand into mine. She was healthier than I had ever seen her. Her lips were not blue. Her breath was not whistling. The new medications had given her back to me in a way I had not believed was possible 6 months ago. She had grown an inch. Her face had filled out. She laughed more easily now and louder, and the sound of her laughter through the kitchen pass-through window was I was learning my favorite sound on earth. "Wave," she said. "Yes, Della." "Do you think Mama would be proud of us?" I thought about it for a long moment. I thought about Rosalind Mercer at 20 standing behind that same counter, smiling at a camera held by a man who would spend the rest of his life looking for her. I thought about the bus she had taken out of Cedar Hollow when she was 19, with her own future folded in her own hand. I thought about a motel room in Billings in 2011, and a letter she had never sent, and the courage it must have taken to walk away from the only safe place she had ever known a second time. I thought about a wet road in Ohio in November of 2013, and the gallon of milk in the back seat of her car, and a man who was texting his girlfriend instead of watching the light. I thought about everything that had been taken from her, and everything she had given us anyway. "Yes, Della," I said. "I think she would." A car turned off the old highway and pulled into the gravel lot. It was a sedan, out-of-state plates. 2 people inside, a man and a woman, both of them looking up at the neon sign through their windshield with the kind of expression I recognized. They were tired. They had been driving a long time. They had not been sure until they saw our lights that anything out here was open. They climbed out. They walked up to the front door. I held the door open for them. The woman thanked me. The man tipped his cap. They sat down in a booth by the window, and Mabel poured them coffee, and Della handed them menus, and somewhere above the counter the wall clock that Thaddeus Whitlock had hung in 1978 ticked steadily forward into the next minute and the next and the next. Some legacies end. Others are just waiting for the right person to continue them. I went behind the counter. I picked up an order pad. I walked over to the booth where the 2 travelers were sitting, and I smiled at them the way my mother had once smiled at every customer she ever served. And I said the words that Thaddeus Whitlock had taught a young woman to say 20 years ago in the same building. "Welcome to Whitlock's. What can I get started for you?" The man looked up at me. His face was lined and tired, the face of a man who had been driving through some kind of dark for a long time. He looked at the menu. He looked at his wife. He looked back at me, and something in his expression softened the way faces soften when a person realizes for the first time in a while that they have come somewhere safe. "Just coffee, please," he said, "and whatever pie you've got." "Coming right up, sir." I walked back behind the counter. Outside, the neon sign hummed its quiet welcome into the darkness. The Ford pickup glinted in the moonlight. The fields beyond the lot stretched out to the horizon, and somewhere far off, a coyote called once and was answered. And I understood finally what Thaddeus Whitlock had been doing all those years. He had not been preparing for a flood or a storm or a power outage or a war. He had been preparing for us, for the lost, for the running, for the desperate, for the hungry, for the cold, for everyone who had ever needed somewhere to walk into out of the dark, for 2 girls from Ohio with $5 between them and a future they did not know how to build. He had been keeping the lights on for us, and now it was our turn to keep the lights on for someone else. I poured 2 cups of coffee. I cut 2 slices of pie. I carried them across the dining room, and I set them down in front of the travelers, And I told them that the pie was on the house tonight because we were celebrating an anniversary, and the man asked me what we were celebrating, and I told him. We were celebrating the day that two sisters from Ohio finally came home.